Welcome to our deep dive into the Black Death in England, going all the way back to 1348 when this pandemic swept through Europe. And, it changed history forever.
Right.
It's more than just names and dates, though. We're talking about societal upheaval, resilience, and, consequences that we still see today.
Absolutely. The sources you've gathered really paint a picture of this time. We have firsthand accounts from people who lived through it, alongside modern research that sheds new light on the plague's impact.
Okay, so let's unpack this. How did this plague even get to England? It wasn't like a flight from Asia.
No, it was a very long and complex journey. Think of it this way. The plague started in Central Asia, and because of trade routes connecting east and west, it hitched a ride westward.
Yeah.
The reach of the Mongol Empire really helped it spread.
So these trade routes, they were like superhighways for the plague, spreading it across continents.
Exactly. By the early 1340s, it had already reached Europe, Sicily, and places like that. Then it spread like wildfire through these major trading hubs. Fast forward to the summer of 1348, English ports like Melcombe Regis,
Oh, wow.
which today is Weymouth, they received ships from mainland Europe. And you can probably guess what those ships brought with them.
I can only imagine. So it was like this historical domino effect.
Yeah.
But this is where it gets interesting, right? Because it's not just about a disease. It's about how people reacted, how they understood the world, how a society grapples with such a huge event. Imagine being in England at that time. How do you even process this?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. This was a time steeped in religion. For many, the plague wasn't just a disease. It was a sign of divine wrath, punishment from God.
So naturally, people turned to prayer and repentance, hoping to appease a higher power. Imagine these processions, the desperation for divine intervention.
Absolutely. But at the same time, there was an urgency to understand what was happening and find some sort of treatment. And this is where the limits of medieval medicine become really clear.
You're talking about the four humors theory, right? I've read about it. Something about keeping the body balanced.
Yeah. Imagine your body as this intricate system where everything needs to be in harmony. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Each humor represents a different aspect of your health and temperament.
Wow.
Too much blood. You might be overly cheerful, excess black bile. You might be prone to melancholy. So illness, in their view, was a disruption of this balance.
So if you're a physician in 1348, how do you even treat the Black Death with this understanding of the body?
That's where it gets interesting. Treatments range from bloodletting to purging, trying to expel these corrupted humors. There were also herbal concoctions, each believed to have some power against the disease.
And what about those masks worn by physicians
Right.
with the long beaks?
Right. They were filled with fragrant herbs to ward off miasma, the bad air that they thought transmitted disease. To me, those masks capture the desperation, the fear, and the ingenuity of that period.
Yeah. It's surreal to think about those practices when 30 to 50% of England's population died in just a few years.
It's hard to grasp that scale of loss.
We're talking about entire villages wiped out,
Right.
deserted,
Right.
ghost towns across the landscape. It shows the Black Death's brutal impact.
It does. And it brings us to a crucial point. It's not just about the loss of life. It's about how this devastation ripples through society. England's social and economic structures were profoundly affected.
But from the ashes of this tragedy, there were some unexpected consequences.
Exactly. Think about labor. With such a smaller workforce, those who survived, especially the peasants, found themselves with more power.
It's like the economics flipped.
Right.
Fewer workers meant higher wages.
Exactly. And this had a ripple effect on the social order, traditional feudal norms, the bonds between peasants and lords. They started to fray. And we see this in the Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351.
That was an attempt to freeze wages.
Yeah.
Right. At pre-plague levels.
Yes, like
Yeah.
hitting rewind on all the social and economic changes, but it backfired. Trying to suppress the new dynamics only fueled unrest. It shows just how deep these transformations were. And of course, we can't talk about the Black Death without talking about religion. It really intensified religious fervor, with people trying to find answers and solace in their faith.
Yeah. If you believe God is in control, and then something like this happens, you would try to figure out what you did wrong to make him angry.
Right, and we see this with the emergence of groups like the Flagellants. They marched through the streets, whipping themselves as penance. Their backs were raw and bleeding, chanting hymns of repentance. Imagine witnessing that. It shows you the desperation and yearning for divine intervention.
Wow. That's an image. It's a side of history we don't think about often. The raw emotion, the psychology of living through something like this. It wasn't just about survival. It was about grappling with the spiritual and existential questions.
Exactly. And the impact on the church wasn't just about increased fervor. The clergy were often caring for the sick, and they were hit hard by the plague. This loss of leadership and the suffering led some to question God's role in all of this.
So people began to wonder, if God is all-powerful and merciful, why is this happening? That's a big shift in thinking.
It really planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the centuries that followed, challenging the church's authority.
Wow. You mentioned how art and literature were influenced by the Black Death. What's a good example?
The dance macabre, or the dance of death. These were very vivid artistic representations. They depicted death, often as a skeleton, leading people from all walks of life in a dance. Kings, peasants, clergy, no one was spared.
I've seen those images. They're haunting. It's like a reminder that death is the great equalizer.
Exactly. It reflects the anxieties of the time, the sudden awareness of mortality, the fragility of life, and questioning traditional hierarchies.
Right. It's a reminder that even in dark times, human creativity finds a way to express itself, to process the unimaginable. But sadly, like with many crises, the Black Death unleashed fear, prejudice, and searching for someone to blame.
Unfortunately, yes. Across Europe, Jewish communities became scapegoats. They were accused of poisoning wells and spreading the plague. They faced persecution and violence.
That's a dark chapter. How fear and ignorance can become hatred and violence. Targeting the vulnerable. It reminds us to be vigilant, to challenge prejudice, and protect the marginalized,
Yeah,
especially during a crisis.
absolutely. It's a lesson that's still important.
Yeah.
But let's change gears a little. We know that Yersinia pestis was the bacteria responsible for the Black Death,
Right.
but could there have been other factors that helped it spread so rapidly?
It's a good question. It makes you wonder, are we still missing pieces of the puzzle?
Well, some research suggests that climate fluctuations may have played a role by affecting rat populations, which we know helped spread the plague. Some even suggest that there were other pathogens around that made people weaker and more vulnerable to the Black Death.
It's like a web of factors,
Yeah.
creating this perfect storm. It shows how important research is to understand these pandemics, both past and present.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really important point. The Black Death wasn't just about death and devastation. It was a turning point, especially for England. It changed things in ways that we still see today.
Wow. So it wasn't just the immediate impact, the death,
Yeah.
the fear, the upheaval. It was a catalyst for long-term change.
Right.
That's a powerful thought. Where do we even begin to unpack that?
Let's start with economics. It might sound strange, but all the death
Yeah.
actually led to a higher standard of living. For some survivors,
Really?
supply and demand. With fewer workers, the value of labor increased. Survivors, especially peasants, could demand higher wages. They had bargaining power.
So the plague empowered. Those at the bottom.
Exactly. This led to the decline of serfdom, which had defined England for centuries. The plague helped dismantle this rigid structure and led to a more dynamic society.
It's like a ripple effect, a tragedy leading to changes that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Right.
Fascinating. What about public health? Did the Black Death lead to any advancements there?
Yes. We see the emergence of some of the first public health measures. They might be rudimentary compared to today, but they were big steps forward. For example, Venice's quarantino, a 40-day isolation for ships arriving from plague-stricken areas.
Wait, so that's where the word quarantine comes from?
You got it.
Wow.
It shows how these practices have shaped language and how we think about disease control. There were also travel restrictions within England and isolating the sick to try and contain the plague.
So even with limited knowledge,
Yeah,
they knew they had to do something. They couldn't just let the plague spread. It's amazing.
it is. And amidst all the horror, there were also acts of courage and compassion. People risked their lives to care for the sick, to bury the dead. These stories show that even in the darkest times, the human spirit shines through.
Yeah, it's amazing how we see those glimmers of hope in the midst of tragedy. It shows how resilient we are to not just survive, but help others, find meaning, even when facing huge loss. Before we wrap up this deep dive, are there any details that really stuck with you from all this material?
You know, one thing that really got to me was how quickly the Black Death could destroy a village.
Yeah.
It could take just weeks for a whole community to become a ghost town. Chroniclers at the time, like Geoffrey the Baker, they described families dying out in days.
It's hard to imagine the speed of it, how it just ripped through communities. The firsthand accounts are just heartbreaking.
They are. And then there's the scale of death, the mass graves. needed to handle all the bodies.
Right.
It's almost impossible to imagine these huge pits filled with the dead,
Yeah.
a real sign of the plague's power. Archaeologists uncover these graves centuries later. It gives us a link to the past, a reminder of what happened.
It really shows that pandemics aren't just events in a book. They've shaped humanity. So as we close out this deep dive, what lessons can we learn from this dark chapter?
That's a good question. For me, one of the biggest takeaways is preparedness. The Black Death showed us how vulnerable we are to a pandemic, and thankfully we've come a long way. But we can't get complacent.
Right.
We need strong public health, good research, and global cooperation to deal with these threats.
Yeah, like we saw with COVID-19.
Exactly.
And we also need to fight misinformation and scapegoating, like what happened to Jewish communities during the Black Death.
Yeah.
It shows how fear and ignorance can lead to injustice and violence.
Right.
It's still relevant today. We've seen misinformation and xenophobia during recent pandemics. We have a responsibility to be critical of information, challenge harmful stereotypes, and advocate for tolerance, especially during crises.
I agree. And finally, I think this story shows how resilient humans are. Even with all the suffering, people rebuilt their lives, adapted,
Yeah.
and found joy and hope, even in darkness. It reminds us that we can endure, we can adapt, we can move forward.
That's a great point. So as we end our deep dive into the Black Death, I'll leave you with a question. How has this event shaped the world we live in today? It's affected so much, from demographics to labor, religion to public health, even art and literature. History isn't just the past. It's a force that shapes the present and influences the future.
It's like those ripples we talked about,
Yeah.
spreading out across time. The Black Death was terrible. But it also led to changes that still affect us today.
That's right. Thanks for joining us on this journey through time. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those questions coming.